The call had come at 3:14 a.m., a sterile digital chime that sliced through the pre-dawn stillness of Julian Croft's penthouse apartment. It wasn't a human voice that delivered the news, but a notification from the Aethelred Logistics Central Command System, an automated dispassionate alert that carried more weight than any scream. Priority shipment. 77B Astra. Status critical failure. Destination, St. Jude's Medical Center. Delivery window missed by 94 minutes. 94 minutes, an eternity. Now, 12 hours later, the silence in the 50th floor boardroom was a different kind, heavier and more accusatory. It was the silence of held breaths and thinly veiled contempt. Julian stood at the head of a monolithic obsidian table, the city of Vantage sprawling beneath him like a circuit board of cold, indifferent lights. Every eye in the room was on him. The board members, a collection of silver-haired sharks his father had once called colleagues, now looked at him as if he were a bug under a microscope. 94 minutes. Julian said, a voice smooth as polished granite. It belonged to Silas Blackwood, the oldest member of the board, a man who had been his father's confidant, and now served as Julian's reluctant mentor. His face, a mask of calm disappointment, was more damning than any overt anger. The cargo was a series of custom-grafted heart valves. A child was on the operating table. They had to use a temporary, less compatible device. The surgery was complicated. Silas let the word hang in the air, a poisonous vapor. Complicated. A corporate euphemism for near fatal. Julian's jaw was a knot of steel. He had read the full report. He knew the child's name, her age, the frantic chaos that had erupted in the operating room when the courier from Aethelred never arrived. The company's slogan etched into the frosted glass wall behind him seemed to mock him. Legacy in motion. Right now it felt like a legacy in ruins. Our internal diagnostics show a complete system collapse at the North Hub sorting facility. Julian said, his voice steady, despite the tremor in his gut. He gestured to the holographic display shimmering above the table. It showed a cascade of red error codes, a digital waterfall of failure. The primary, secondary, and tertiary routing protocols all failed simultaneously. The package was rerouted to a dead-end container bound for archival storage. By the time human operators identified the error, it was too late. Simultaneously scoffed another board member, a man named Sterling. That sounds less like a system failure and more like an act of God, Julian. Or incompetence. Julian's gaze hardened. The system was designed by my father, Mr. Sterling. It has redundancies for its redundancies. The statistical probability of such a collapse is less than 0. And yet it happened. Silas interjected, his voice a calming balm that only inflamed Julian's frustration. The question is not how, but why. And what we are going to do about the fact that our billion-dollar reputation is currently being torn to shreds on every news network from here to Tokyo. He was right. The fallout had been immediate and brutal. Aethelred Logistics wasn't just any courier service. It was the gold standard handling everything from sensitive legal documents to priceless artifacts and critical medical supplies. Their entire brand was built on one word: reliability. And that brand was now bleeding out on the floor of this boardroom. The meeting dragged on for another hour, a grueling post-mortem filled with corporate platitudes and thinly veiled threats about shareholder confidence. Julian presented the action plan his executive team had scrambled to put together: a full system audit, a public apology, a massive donation to the hospital. It was all standard procedure, the corporate playbook for disaster management. It felt hollow. It felt like a lie. Because Julian knew something they didn't. Or rather, he suspected something they refused to acknowledge. This wasn't the first time. For the past 6 months, small, inexplicable glitches had been cropping up across the network. A shipment of microprocessors vanishing from a secure transport for 3 hours before mysteriously reappearing. A climate-controlled container suddenly deactivating, spoiling a batch of rare orchids. Minor incidents, all of them officially logged as random hardware malfunctions or human error. But Julian had heard the whispers from the engineers and the warehouse foremen, the ones with grease on their hands and exhaustion in their eyes. They spoke of a ghost in the machine, a phantom that moved through the company's intricate systems, causing just enough chaos to disrupt, but never enough to be definitively traced. He had brought it up in a previous meeting, but Silas had dismissed it as corporate folklore. Every complex system has its gremlins, Julian. Don't chase shadows. Focus on the bottom line. Now the shadow had a body count. When the meeting finally adjourned, the board members filed out, leaving Julian alone with Silas. The older man walked over to the vast window, his hands clasped behind his back. "Your father was a brilliant man," Silas said, his reflection a pale ghost against the skyline. "He built an empire on logic and precision, but he was also a man of action. When something was broken, he would go and put his own hands on it until it was fixed. He wouldn't hide behind reports and diagnostics." The words were a calculated strike, and they hit their mark. Julian felt a familiar pang, the inadequacy of being the son of a legend. Alistair Croft had been a titan, a man who knew every inch of his company, from the boardroom to the loading docks. Julian, by contrast, was a man of data and strategy. He ran the company from this glass tower, a remote god directing a world he never truly touched. "I am not my father, Silas," Julian said quietly. "No," Silas agreed, turning to face him. His eyes, usually warm and avuncular, were now sharp and probing. "You're not. The question is, who are you going to be, the CEO who lost it all, or the one who fixed it?" With that parting shot, Silas left, and the silence returned deeper than before. Julian stared at the holographic error codes, the digital ghost of his failure. The official report was a dead end. The internal investigation would be a sanitized corporate affair designed to find a scapegoat, not the truth. The ghost. Whatever it was too smart, too elusive. It knew the system. It moved within the cracks he couldn't see from the 50th floor. A cold, hard clarity began to form in his mind. If you want to find a ghost, you have to go where it lives. You have to walk the haunted halls yourself. His father wouldn't have stayed in the tower. He would have gone to the North Hub. He would have talked to the night shift, looked at the broken sorting machine with his own eyes, felt the pulse of his company at its most fundamental level. Silas was right. Hiding behind reports was a coward's game. An idea, insane and reckless, began to take root. It was a desperate gamble, a complete departure from every business school protocol he had ever learned. But the more he considered it, the more right it felt. He couldn't trust his executive team, not completely. The leak, the sabotage, could be coming from anywhere, even from within this very room. He needed eyes and ears on the ground, untainted by corporate hierarchy. His own. He walked over to his private terminal and began to type. First, he initiated a 2-week executive leave of absence, citing personal reasons. He delegated his immediate duties to his COO, a capable but unimaginative woman who would keep the ship steady but wouldn't rock the boat. Next, he accessed the company's human resources portal, navigating to the new hire application for entry-level logistics operatives at the North Hub. He began to build a person from scratch. No prestigious education, no glittering resume. Just a simple, believable backstory. Name: Leo Carter. Previous experience: a series of dead-end jobs at now-defunct warehouses. Address: a low-rent apartment on the city's industrial outskirts. References: fabricated and untraceable. He uploaded a photograph he'd taken years ago on a backpacking trip. One where he was unshaven, his hair unkempt, his face leaner and hungrier. Unrecognizable. The final step was the most symbolic. He went into his private ensuite bathroom, a space of marble and chrome, and stared at his reflection. The face of Julian Croft, CEO. Sharp suit, expensive watch, a haircut that cost more than a week's wages for the men on his warehouse floor. He stripped it all away. The suit was replaced with worn jeans and a faded, nondescript t-shirt he bought from an all-night convenience store. The Patek Philippe watch was locked in a safe, replaced by a cheap digital Casio. He spent an hour roughing up a pair of new steel-toed boots, scuffing them against the concrete of his balcony, until they looked lived in and weary. As the sun began to rise, casting a golden glow over the city that was his birthright, he looked at his reflection again. The transformation was startling. The CEO was gone. In his place was a stranger, someone you wouldn't look at twice. A ghost in the making. Leo Carter. He picked up a worn canvas backpack containing little more than a change of clothes and the burner phone he'd activated under his new name. As he walked out of the penthouse, leaving behind the silent testament to his wealth and power, he didn't feel fear. He felt a surge of something he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. He wasn't just going to hunt a ghost. He was going to become one. He was going down into the belly of the beast his father had built, not as its king, but as a nobody. And as Leo Carter, a man with nothing to lose, he would finally see the truth. The north hub of Aethelred Logistics was less a building and more a small self-contained universe of relentless motion. Julian now, Leo Carter, stepped through the employee entrance and was immediately hit by a wall of sound, the high-pitched whine of automated sorters, the deep rumble of conveyor belts a mile long, the percussive clap of pneumatic lifts and the constant echoing beep of handheld scanners. The air smelled of ozone warm plastic and the faint dusty scent of a million cardboard boxes. This was the heart of his empire, a marvel of engineering he had only ever seen through sanitized drone footage and data-rich schematics on a screen. The reality was grittier, louder, and infinitely more human. His orientation was a 5-minute blur conducted by a harried supervisor who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He handed Leo a scanner, a safety vest that had seen better days, and a locker key. Zone C picking and packing. Keep your scan rate above 95%. Don't fall behind. Don't get in the way of the AGVs. Lunch is at noon. Any questions? The man didn't wait for an answer before his radio crackled, and he was gone, swallowed by the chaos. Zone C was a cavernous section of the warehouse where towering shelves 10 stories high held a dizzying array of packages. Automated guided vehicles, sleek silent robots glided along magnetic paths on the floor, delivering pallets with an eerie grace. Julian's job, however, was far from futuristic. He was assigned to a manual picking line, a place where packages of awkward sizes rejected by the automated system were sorted by hand. It was grueling, mind-numbing work. His body, accustomed to tailored suits and ergonomic office chairs, protested almost immediately. His back ached from bending and lifting. The scanner, an older model he knew was due for an upgrade 3 years ago, felt like a brick in his hand. The software was sluggish, frequently misreading barcodes and forcing him to manually input long tracking numbers. He saw now why the efficiency reports for this sector were always so poor. It wasn't lazy workers. It was neglected technology. Around him, other workers moved with a practiced, weary rhythm. No one spoke much. They were islands of humanity, in a sea of automation, their faces etched with a fatigue that went deeper than physical exertion. It was the fatigue of being a cog in a machine that didn't care if you were breaking down. It was halfway through his morning shift when he first saw her. A crisis had erupted at the junction of 3 major conveyor belts. An overloaded sorting chute had jammed, sending a tidal wave of packages spilling onto the floor. Alarms blared, red lights flashed, and the entire section ground to a halt. Supervisors shouted into their radios, but the chaos only escalated. Amid the pandemonium, one person was a point of calm focus. She stood before a control console, her brow furrowed in concentration. She had dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her eyes, a startlingly clear shade of blue, moved rapidly across the multiple diagnostic screens. She typed with a swift, no-nonsense efficiency, her fingers flying across the keyboard. This, Julian surmised, must be a dispatcher. He watched as she bypassed the standard reboot protocol, a time-consuming process he knew was mostly useless for a physical jam. Instead, she was manually rerouting the incoming package flow to a secondary line isolating the jammed section. It was a smart, decisive move that would save the company thousands in downtime. It was a move Julian himself would have made. He found himself drifting closer, drawn by her competence. "The pressure sensor on chute 7 is faulty," he said, his voice quiet enough that only she could hear over the din. "It's misreading the package volume. That's why it keeps jamming." She didn't look up, but her typing paused for a fraction of a second. And how would a new picker know that her tone wasn't accusatory, just curious sharp? "Saw it happen twice already this morning," he lied smoothly. "Seems like every time a B-class container over 20 kilos passes, it trips the overflow alert even when the chute is clear. It's creating a false bottleneck." Now she turned her blue eyes, appraising him. He saw a flicker of surprise, then a weary sort of recognition. She had seen the problem too, he realized. She just hadn't expected anyone else to notice, least of all a new guy in a worn-out vest. "I've filed 3 work orders on that sensor in the last month," she said, her voice laced with frustration. "They keep closing the ticket, saying the diagnostics show it's within operational parameters." "Diagnostics don't account for metal fatigue in the mounting bracket," Julian replied, forgetting for a moment who he was supposed to be. "The vibrations from the main belt are throwing the calibration off. You'd only see it if you were standing right here." She stared at him for a long moment, a silent conversation passing between them. Then she turned back to her console. "What's your name?" Leo Carter. Elara Vance," she said, her attention already back on the screen. "Well, Leo Carter, thanks for confirming I'm not crazy." She finished her rerouting and keyed in a new, more urgent maintenance request, adding a note: physical inspection of chute 7 sensor mounting bracket required. Confirm visual malfunction. The immediate crisis was averted. Maintenance crews arrived to clear the physical jam, and within 20 minutes the belts were moving again. But the brief exchange had left its mark on Julian. He had found a spark of brilliance in the gloom, an employee who not only understood the system, but cared enough to fight it. He also saw with chilling clarity how that spark was being systematically ignored and extinguished by corporate bureaucracy. His own bureaucracy. His education in the company's decay continued an hour later with the arrival of Marcus Thorne. The regional manager didn't walk onto the warehouse floor. He descended upon it. He was a tall, impeccably dressed man whose polished shoes seemed to repel the dust and grime of the warehouse. He moved with an aura of predatory confidence, flanked by two nervous-looking supervisors. He wasn't there to inspect the machinery or check on morale. He was hunting. His eyes scanned the floor, ignoring the broader operational flow and zeroing in on individual workers. They settled on a young man at the end of Julian's line who was struggling to lift a heavy, awkward crate. The young man's scan rate, displayed on a large public monitor above the line, had dipped into the red. Thorne glided over his voice, cutting through the noise. "Peterson." The young man flinched, nearly dropping the crate. "Sir, your rate is at 89%, Thorne stated, as if announcing a death sentence. "That is unacceptable. This company does not pay for 89%. It pays for 100, and I expect 110. I'm sorry, sir. This crate, the weight isn't logged correctly. It requires a two-person lift, but excuses." Thorne snapped his voice dangerously low. Aethelred was built by men who found solutions, not excuses. Your performance reflects on me, and I do not tolerate poor reflections. He tapped a few commands into his tablet. You're on a formal warning. If your rate isn't back in the green by the end of your shift, you will be on final notice. Are we clear? Yes, sir. The young man mumbled, his face pale with humiliation. Thorne gave him one last withering look before sweeping away, leaving a wake of fear behind him. The other workers immediately picked up their pace, a frantic energy born of terror rippling down the line. Julian's fists were clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. He had seen Thorne's reports. They were always glowing, filled with impressive-sounding metrics about productivity and efficiency. Now he saw how those numbers were achieved not through innovation or leadership, but through brute force and intimidation. This wasn't a culture of excellence. It was a culture of fear. A plantation disguised as a modern logistics hub. He glanced over at the dispatch station. Elara was watching the scene. Her jaw tight, her expression a mixture of anger and resignation. She had seen this happen 100 times before. The rest of the day was a long, painful immersion in his own company's sickness. He saw safety protocols ignored in the name of speed. He saw workers using their own money to buy better gloves because the company-issued ones fell apart in a week. He heard them talk during their brief lunch break, not about their families or their lives, but about their scan rates, their shift schedules, and the ever-present fear of being put on Thorne's list. They were good people trapped in a bad system, a system he had allowed to fester. As the final bell signaled the end of his shift, Julian walked out into the cool evening air, his body screaming in protest. Every muscle ached. His hands were raw. He felt a bone-deep exhaustion he had never known in his life of late-night meetings and jet-lagged flights. He sat on a concrete curb in the sprawling employee parking lot, watching the second-shift workers file in their faces, already set in grim lines of determination. His penthouse, with its panoramic views and silent conditioned air, felt like it was on another planet. He had come down here looking for a ghost, a saboteur, a single point of failure he could isolate and fix. But he was wrong. The ghost wasn't one person or one broken piece of code. It was a sickness in the very soul of his company. It was the collective despair of 1,000 workers who felt invisible. It was the arrogance of a manager like Thorne who ruled by fear. It was the blind ignorance of a CEO in an ivory tower. The problem wasn't a ghost in the machine. The machine itself was becoming a ghost, a hollow shell of his father's dream. its spirit slowly being crushed. And as he stared at the massive humming warehouse, the full terrifying weight of his task settled upon him. He wasn't just here to fix a technical problem, he was here to perform an exorcism. A week on the floor of the North Hub had hardened Leo Carter into existence. The phantom aches in Julian Croft's muscles had been replaced by a deep, resonant weariness that was now a part of him. He moved with the economy of motion. All the floor workers shared his body, learning a new language of lifting, turning, and scanning. But while his body adapted, his mind was in overdrive. He was no longer just observing. He was mapping the sickness, tracing the veins of dysfunction that ran through the heart of the warehouse. He saw how the best workers were penalized by a system that valued speed over accuracy, leading to a cascade of small compounding errors. He saw how maintenance requests for critical machinery were consistently downgraded in priority in favor of cosmetic fixes for the executive walkways. And he saw most of all how Marcus Thorne's shadow touched everything, creating a climate where reporting a problem was a greater sin than causing one. The impossible task arrived on a Tuesday disguised as a routine priority flag. A client, Kronos Quantum, was reporting a missing shipment, a crate of prototype quantum processors valued at $8 million. They were irreplaceable, the culmination of a decade of research, and they were supposed to be on a climate-controlled high-security transport to a research facility in California. The system, however, showed their last known location as Docking Bay 17 of the North Hub, scanned and logged as awaiting transfer for the past 48 hours. But the crate wasn't there. Panic began to simmer at the executive level, a tremor Julian could feel even from the floor. An all-hands email from Thorne announced a full lockdown of the hub. No shipments in or out until the processors were found. The blame was immediately cast upon the previous night shift with Thorne's memo, all but accusing them of gross negligence. Julian found Elara at her dispatch console, her face a pale mask of stress. Her screen was a chaotic spiderweb of conflicting data logs. "It makes no sense," she muttered more to herself than to him as he approached. The crate was scanned in by the automated receiving gate. It was assigned a temporary holding spot in the high-security cage, but there's no outbound scan, no transfer log, no record of it ever leaving the cage. Yet it's gone. It's like it just evaporated. Supervisors were swarming the high-security area, a glass and steel enclosure in the center of the warehouse. The mood was grim. This was no mere misplaced package. This was a catastrophic breach. "Can you pull up the raw sensor logs from the cage?" Leo asked quietly, leaning against a nearby pillar trying to look like a curious bystander. Elara shot him a sharp look. "Raw logs, Leo, that's thousands of lines of code. We have the summary manifests for a reason. The manifests can be edited," he said, his eyes fixed on the cage. "The raw sensor data can't. Every time that cage door opens, the magnetic lock sends a time-stamped data packet to the central server. Every time a new RFID tag enters or leaves its field, it gets logged. No one can erase that without leaving a digital footprint the size of a mountain." Elara paused, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. He was right. It was a brute force approach, a needle in a haystack search, but it was also infallible. It was the kind of suggestion an engineer would make, not a picker. Her curiosity about the quiet, observant new worker deepened. "All right, haystack," she sighed, pulling up a new window. "Get ready for a data dump." For the next hour they worked. Elara navigated the complex system with a speed that impressed him while Leo stood behind her, his eyes scanning the torrent of alphanumeric code scrolling up the screen. He directed her, his voice low and calm. "Filter by event type, magnetic lock, disengaged. Cross-reference those timestamps with the internal security camera logs." As Elara worked, Marcus Thorne appeared near the high-security cage, his expression thunderous. He wasn't helping the search. He was directing the blame. Julian watched him pull aside a supervisor and launch into a tirade, his voice too low to hear, but his gestures sharp and angry. Then Thorne broke away and walked to a nearby administrative terminal, the same one Julian had seen him use before. Thorne began typing furiously. He seemed to be reviewing manifests, his brow furrowed. But Julian, who knew the architecture of the system he was using, noticed something was off. Thorne wasn't just viewing data. The slight flicker of the screen, the way his hands moved in a sequence of command overrides, told Julian that he was in an editing module. He was altering a record. "Got it," Elara suddenly said, snapping Julian's attention back to her screen. "Here, look." She pointed to a line of code. The cage was opened at 02:47 a.m. Right here. But there's no corresponding security log of a guard opening the door. It was an electronic override originating from a remote IP. An external hack, Elara wondered aloud. No, Leo said, his eyes narrowing as he watched Thorn finish his work and stride away from the terminal. Not external. Look at the IP address. It's been masked, but the subnet is internal. It came from inside this building. A cold silence settled between them. The implications were chilling. This wasn't negligence. This was a deliberate high-tech theft. But the crate is still gone, Elara said, her voice strained. Knowing how it was stolen doesn't help us find it. It's still in the building, Leo insisted. His mind was racing, putting the pieces together. The override. Thorn's data manipulation. This was a cover-up. They wouldn't risk moving something that valuable out of the hub during a lockdown. They've hidden it, relabeled it, made it look like something else. He scanned the layout of the warehouse in his mind. Where's the one place a high-value climate-controlled package could be stored indefinitely without raising suspicion? Elara's eyes widened. Cold Storage Unit 4, the archival biologics section. It's temperature stable and requires level 3 clearance. No one ever goes there unless they have to. Get me the inventory manifest for that unit. Leo said, his voice now holding a new edge of authority that made Elara look at him again. She didn't question it. She just typed. As the manifest loaded, Julian knew he had to get to the terminal Thorn had used. He needed to see what the manager had changed. I need to log my break, he said to Elara, a plausible excuse. He walked over to the now vacant terminal, his heart pounding a steady, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He logged in with his low-level credentials. Everything looked normal on the surface, but he could feel it, a faint system lag, a ghost in the machine. He knew Thorn was arrogant, but he was also meticulous. He wouldn't have left an obvious trail. Julian's fingers moved not on the graphical interface, but in a series of keystrokes that seemed random. Ctrl plus Alt, Shift plus F12. It was a backdoor he himself had programmed into the operating system's kernel years ago, a diagnostic tool for developers that he had never removed. A black command line window appeared on the screen, a sight no ordinary worker would ever see. The ghost process was there just as he suspected, a temporary data scrubbing application. It was designed to erase any recent command logs within the next 5 minutes. He was running out of time. He typed another command, one that accessed the system's temporary file directory. A list of recently created and modified files appeared. Most were gibberish system-generated cache files, but one stood out. Alpha manifest rev.crypt. It was an encrypted file. It shouldn't have been there. Thorn must have created it as a backup of the original manifest before he altered it, planning to delete it after the fact. In his haste, he had forgotten. With shaking hands, Julian plugged a small, nondescript USB drive into the port. He initiated the copy, his eyes darting around the warehouse floor. No one was watching. The progress bar crawled across the screen with agonizing slowness. 1 megabyte. 2. It was a small file, but it felt like he was stealing the blueprints to a nuclear weapon. Copy complete. He ejected the drive, pocketed it, and closed the command line window just as the scrubbing application would have wiped the directory clean. The screen returned to its normal, placid state. He logged out. The entire operation had taken less than 90 seconds. He walked back to Elara, his expression unreadable. She was looking at him, a strange mix of awe and suspicion on her face. You were right, she said, her voice barely a whisper. She pointed to her screen. I cross-referenced the weight and dimension data. There's a crate in Cold Storage Unit 4, labeled as expired biological samples for incineration. But its profile matches the quantum processor shipment exactly. They had found it. Julian felt a surge of triumph, but it was cold and sharp-edged with danger. He had done more than just find a missing package. He now held a piece of the conspiracy in the palm of his hand. This encrypted file was the first real clue, the first tangible proof that the ghost was not just a myth, but a carefully orchestrated plot. He looked at Elara, whose face was now alight with a fierce, determined energy. In that moment, he knew he had found something else too, an ally. Someone who, like him, was willing to look for the truth in the whispers of the code. The weight of the small USB drive in his pocket felt immense. It was a key, but he knew it could also be a trigger. Unlocking its secrets could save his company, or it could get them both killed. The USB drive felt like a burning coal in Julian's pocket for the next 12 hours. He finished his shift in a state of heightened awareness, every shadow seeming to hold a threat, every glance from a supervisor feeling like an accusation. He knew he couldn't keep the file with him. It was too dangerous, and he lacked the decryption tools and security clearance to access it without tripping a dozen alarms on the Aethelred network. There was only one person he could trust with it, even if that trust now felt like a fragile, desperate gamble. Gideon. Getting the drive to him was a logistical challenge of its own. Julian Croft, CEO, could summon his head of security with a single text message. Leo Carter warehouse operative could not. A direct meeting at the corporate tower was out of the question. He needed a neutral, anonymous space, a place where two men from vastly different worlds could meet without raising eyebrows. He spent a sleepless night in his sparse temporary apartment, the constant rumble of the elevated train outside a jarring counterpoint to the silent luxury he was used to. The next morning, using his burner phone, he sent a single coded text to Gideon's private number, Old Haunt. 4 p.m. Urgent. Old Haunt was a dusty, forgotten corner of the city, a small family-owned bookstore cafe where they had spent countless hours studying during their university days. It was a place of worn leather armchairs and the comforting smell of aging paper, a relic from a life before Aethelred had consumed them both. At 3:55 p.m., Julian, dressed as Leo, sat at a secluded table in the back, a cup of bitter coffee growing cold in front of him. Gideon arrived exactly on time, a habit ingrained from his years in military intelligence. He was a broad, powerfully built man whose casual blazer did little to hide the disciplined strength beneath. His face, usually open and friendly, was etched with concern as he slid into the chair opposite Julian. "Julian, what the hell is this?" Gideon's voice was a low rumble. "Your office said you're on a personal leave. You disappear and then I get a ghost text from a burner. You look like you haven't slept in a month. Talk to me." "I can't explain everything," Julian said, his voice raspy. "Not yet. Just know that I'm onto something. Something big. The St. Jude's incident wasn't an accident." Gideon leaned back, his professional skepticism kicking in. He crossed his arms over his chest. "We ran the diagnostics. The report was conclusive. It was a catastrophic, 1 in a billion system failure." "It was sabotage," Julian insisted, leaning forward. "I have proof. Or the beginning of it." He slid the small USB drive across the table. It looked insignificant, a tiny piece of black plastic against the dark wood. This was on an administrative terminal at the North Hub right after the Kronos processors were found. It was hidden, encrypted, and set to be wiped. Someone made a mistake. Gideon picked up the drive, examining it as if it were an unexploded ordnance. "And you just happened to find this, Julian. This sounds like a conspiracy theory. You've been under a tremendous amount of stress." The patronizing tone, the well-meaning concern, was like a knife in Julian's gut. This was his oldest friend, the man he'd trusted with his life on more than one occasion, and he was being treated like a paranoid child. "Just analyze it, Gideon," Julian said, his voice tight with restrained anger. "No questions. Use your best people off the Aethelred network. I need to know what's on it. I need to know who it points to. This ghost, this saboteur is real, and they are tearing the company apart from the inside." Gideon sighed a long, weary sound. He pocketed the drive. "All right, Julian. I'll look into it. I'll run it through our off-site forensics lab. But I'm telling you, as your friend, this feels like a witch hunt. You're chasing shadows. The board is already nervous. If they get wind that you're running some kind of covert internal investigation based on a hunch, they'll have your head." "Let them try," Julian said grimly. "Just get me what's on that drive." Gideon stood up, his expression a mixture of duty and deep worry. "Be careful, man. Whatever game you're playing it alone." He turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving Julian with his cold coffee and the suffocating feeling of total isolation. Back at the North Hub the next day, the atmosphere was different. The recovery of the Kronos processors was the talk of the floor. Officially, Marcus Thorne was the hero. A company-wide memo had praised his decisive leadership and tireless efforts in coordinating the search. There was no mention of a dispatcher who had found the critical clue or a new picker who had pointed her in the right direction, but the people on the floor knew. As Leo worked, he noticed the small nods of respect from other workers, the way they made eye contact with him now. He had been an anonymous cog, now he was something more. Elara especially treated him with a new sense of partnership. They found their moment of quiet during the afternoon lull, standing on a deserted loading dock, the cool breeze a welcome relief from the stuffy air of the warehouse. He took all the credit, Elara said, staring out at the rail yard. Thorn, I mean. Not that I'm surprised. It's not about the credit, Leo replied, leaning against the railing. It's about the fact that the problem still isn't fixed. That crate didn't misplace itself. I know. She turned to face him, her blue eyes searching his face. I've never seen anyone read the system logs like you did. You're not a standard issue picker, are you? Leo Carter? Julian's heart skipped a beat. He summoned the backstory he had rehearsed. Worked for a smaller logistics company back east. Went bankrupt. They made us learn a bit of everything from driving a forklift to basic network diagnostics. Just trying to be useful. It was a plausible lie, but he could tell she wasn't entirely convinced. She saw something more in him, an incongruity she couldn't quite place. Instead of pressing, she changed the subject. Why do you do it? She asked. This job. It's a dead end. It grinds people down. You're smart enough to do something else. Why are you here? The question was more profound than she knew. He gave her a piece of the truth filtered through Leo's persona. I had a family business once. We lost it. I guess I'm here because I want to understand how a good thing can fall apart, how a place with a strong foundation can rot from the inside. A look of deep empathy crossed her face. I get that, she said softly. My dad was a mechanic, owned his own garage. He used to say you could have the best engine in the world, but if the fuel line is clogged, you're not going anywhere. This place, it has a clogged fuel line. She looked back towards the humming warehouse. It used to be different. I've been here 5 years. When I started, there was a sense of pride. Mr. Croft. The old man, I mean. He used to walk the floor sometimes. He knew people's names. He cared. Now. She trailed off, shaking her head. Hearing her speak of his father with such reverence sent a sharp, painful jolt through Julian. This was the legacy he was failing to uphold. Elara was the kind of employee his father would have cherished, loyal, intelligent, and fiercely principled. And his own administration was crushing her spirit. Maybe someone just needs to clean the line, he said, his voice quiet. A small, sad smile touched her lips. Maybe. But the mechanics are all afraid of the guy who owns the car. Their conversation was cut short by the roar of a truck pulling into the bay. The moment of connection was over, but something had shifted between them. It was a bond forged in shared frustration and mutual respect. He was drawn to her unwavering integrity, and she was intrigued by the quiet, capable man with the observant eyes and the soul of an engineer. As he walked back inside, Julian felt the painful duality of his existence more sharply than ever. As Leo, he was building a genuine connection, earning trust through his actions. As Julian, he was utterly alone, his best friend doubting his sanity. His company in the hands of enemies, he couldn't see his only true ally, a woman who had no idea who he was. He was a ghost in his own house, and the loneliness of it was a cold, heavy weight in the center of his chest. The file was his only hope, a single thread in the dark. Now all he could do was wait for Gideon to call, and pray that when he did, he would have an answer that didn't confirm his deepest fear that he truly was on his own. In the sterile, glass-walled office that overlooked the warehouse floor like a predator's perch, Marcus Thorne watched the man who called himself Leo Carter. For a week, Thorne had been observing him. He had reread the man's flimsy file a dozen times. A series of defunct employers, no verifiable references, a ghost. Yet this ghost moved with the quiet confidence of a master chess player. He was efficient, unnervingly so. He saw patterns in the chaos that even Thorne's best supervisors missed, and most damningly he had the ear of Elara Vance, the one dispatcher Thorne couldn't intimidate because she was simply too good at her job. The recovery of the Chronos processors had been a victory for Thorne on paper, but a quiet humiliation in reality. He knew with a cold certainty that the recovery hadn't been luck. It had been skill, and that skill had originated with the new picker. A man like Leo Carter didn't belong on a manual sorting line. He was a threat, an unknown variable in a carefully controlled equation. And Marcus Thorne eliminated variables. His plan was a thing of cruel elegance, a logistical puzzle with no solution. It was a hot-load cross-docking transfer, the most high-pressure task in the entire facility. A shipment of sensitive avionics components for a major aerospace client was arriving. The components were needed for a just-in-time assembly line. A delay of even 30 minutes would trigger astronomical penalty clauses. The shipment had to be unloaded, its contents verified against the manifest, and immediately reloaded onto a different outbound truck within a 20-minute window. It was difficult under the best of circumstances. Thorn had decided to make it impossible. He personally altered the assignment parameters in the system. He set the inbound truck to arrive at Bay 9, while assigning the outbound truck to Bay 23 at the opposite end of the massive facility. He flagged the shipment as standard freight, deliberately omitting the mandatory special handling fragile electronics protocol. Finally, he manipulated the outbound truck's scheduled departure time, moving it up by 10 minutes. He had created a perfect storm, a task designed to fail in a way that would place the blame squarely on the shoulders of the floor operative. The system logs would show a competent manager and a hopelessly inept worker. "Get me Carter," Thorn barked into his intercom. "Tell him he's on the hot load at Bay 9. Effective immediately." Leo was sorting packages when a supervisor tapped him on the shoulder, his face grim. "You're on the avionics transfer." Thorn's orders. A murmur went through the nearby workers. The hot load was a dreaded assignment, a public execution for anyone who had fallen out of favor. As Leo walked toward Bay 9, his scanner beeped. It was a direct message from Elara, a feature they rarely used. "System shows conflicting data on this transfer. Be careful." He arrived at the bay just as the inbound truck was backing in. The manifest was a nightmare. 30 crates of varying sizes and weights. The clock was already ticking. The system showed he had 20 minutes. His gut and Elara's warning told him he had less. He began to work his body, moving with a fluid efficiency that drew the attention of the loading crew. He scanned the first crate and immediately saw the first sign of the trap. The weight was logged at 50 pounds. His experience told him the crate with its heavy-duty casing was closer to 100. It was a deliberate misentry to slow him down. His scanner beeped again. "Elara, outbound is at Bay 23. Departure time has been advanced. You have 10 minutes, maybe 12. Go." 10 minutes. To unload, verify, and move 30 crates across half a mile of warehouse floor. It was impossible. A cold fury settled in Julian's stomach. This wasn't a test. It was an assassination attempt on a man's career. He looked around for a powered pallet jack, the standard equipment for a job like this. They were all in use or inexplicably located at the far end of the facility. Another part of the trap. He was meant to move these by hand, one by one. He made a decision. He wasn't going to play Thorn's game by Thorn's rules. He ran to the nearest AGV charging station. These robots were programmed to follow specific routes, their programming inaccessible to floor workers. But Julian Croft knew the developer's master override codes. He pulled out his scanner, its screen shielded by his body, and typed a rapid sequence of commands into its messaging interface, a string of code that looked like nonsense. "Execute override dodge protocol 7. Target AGV 113. Reroute priority alpha. Path B9 to B23. Engage." He sent the message not to Elara but to the warehouse's central server. 100 yards away, an AGV that had been sitting dormant suddenly powered on its blue indicator light flashing. It detached from its charging port and glided silently towards him, ignoring its pre-programmed path. The other workers stared in stunned silence. An AGV had never gone off-route before. As the robot arrived, Elara's voice crackled over his headset, a channel she must have opened just for them. "Leo, what did you do?" The whole AGV grid just lit up with error flags. "They're saying a unit has gone rogue." "I borrowed it," he said, his voice a low grunt as he heaved the first heavy crate onto the robot's flatbed. "Keep them distracted. Tell them it's a sensor glitch. Buy me time." From his office, Marcus Thorn watched the scene unfold on his security monitor, his knuckles white as he gripped his desk. This was not part of the plan. Carter wasn't failing. He was improvising, adapting with an impossible level of ingenuity. He was cheating. Thorn grabbed his radio. "Security to the central corridor. We have a rogue AGV. Intercept and deactivate it immediately." Back on the floor, Leo was loading the last of the crates onto the hijacked robot. He could hear the heavy footfalls of security guards approaching. "They're coming for your ride," Elara's voice warned in his ear, and the outbound truck just started its engine. "You have 2 minutes, Leo." 2 minutes. He slammed the last crate into place and jumped onto the back of the AGV, clinging to the stacked boxes. "Tell the driver of that truck he has an unauthorized pallet lock on his rear axle, and he can't move until it's cleared by dispatch," he commanded. "What I can't do, that's a major protocol violation." "Trust me, Elara, There was a half-second of hesitation. Then he heard her voice transformed authoritative over the main dispatch channel. "Driver at Bay 23, this is Central Dispatch. Hold your position. I repeat, hold your position. We have a system flag on your axle lock." The AGV shot forward, a silent metal steed carrying its rider and precious cargo through the labyrinthine corridors of the warehouse. Julian flattened himself against the crates as they sped past shelves and under gantries. The two security guards were closing in, but the robot was faster. They rounded the final corner and saw it, the outbound truck at Bay 23, its engine rumbling, the driver arguing into his radio. Leo jumped off the AGV before it had even come to a complete stop. He grabbed a manual hand crank lift and began the frantic process of moving the crates from the robot into the truck. It was a race against pure physics, his muscles screaming, his lungs burning. 1 crate, 2, 10. The security guards arrived breathless and angry. "Step away from the AGV," now one of them shouted. From his office window, Thorne watched in disbelief. He was witnessing the impossible. He saw the last crate being loaded. He saw Carter slam the truck door shut and slap the side twice, the universal signal for go. Elara's voice came over the main channel again, calm and clear. "Axle lock flag cleared Bay 23. You are free to depart. Apologies for the delay." The truck pulled away from the dock right on time. Leo Carter stood on the empty loading dock chest, heaving, drenched in sweat. He had won an unwinnable game. A slow clap echoed from the doorway of the loading dock. Marcus Thorne stood there, his face a chilling mask of calm fury. The security guards immediately straightened up. "Impressive," Carter Thorne said, his voice soft, almost a purr. He walked slowly towards Julian, his polished shoes clicking on the concrete. He didn't look at the AGV or the guards. His eyes were locked on Julian's. "Very impressive. You seem to have a remarkable talent for solving problems, an almost intimate knowledge of our systems." Julian said nothing, just met his gaze, his heart hammering against his ribs. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a cold, sharp sense of dread. Thorne stopped just a few feet away. "You're very, very good at your job, Leo Carter," he whispered, his voice dripping with venomous insinuation. "Almost too good. A man with your unique skills warrants special attention." He smiled, a thin, cruel slash of a smile. "We're going to be watching you very closely." He turned on his heel and walked away, the security guards trailing in his wake like hyenas following a lion. Julian stood alone on the loading dock, the vast humming warehouse behind him. He had survived the trap. He had proven his worth. But in doing so, he had torn away the camouflage of his anonymity. He was no longer just a curious observer, a ghost hunting another. He was now the prey. The days following the confrontation with Thorne were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Julian felt a constant prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the undeniable feeling of being watched. Thorne was a constant presence, no longer just a remote tyrant in a glass office, but a physical specter. He would appear at the end of an aisle observing Leo's work, with an unnerving stillness. He would personally review Leo's scan rates, searching for any deviation, any slip-up. He had turned the entire warehouse into a cage, and Leo was the specimen under observation. The other workers gave him a wide berth. They respected what he had done, but they feared the attention it had drawn. He was marked, and no one wanted to be caught in the blast radius when Thorne finally decided to act. Even his interactions with Elara were now fraught with a new tension. They still exchanged information, quiet warnings, and vital data, but their conversations were clipped, furtive, held in the fleeting privacy of a noisy corridor. The easy camaraderie of the loading dock was gone, replaced by the grim necessity of co-conspirators. Julian was trapped in a state of suspended dread, performing the repetitive physical labor of his cover while his mind spun with 1,000 frantic calculations. He was waiting for Thorne to make a move, but more than that, he was waiting for the call from Gideon. The USB drive was his only offensive weapon, his only hope of breaking the siege. Every passing hour of silence from his friend felt like a new turn of the screw. The call came on a Friday afternoon at the peak of the end-of-week rush. Julian's burner phone vibrated in his pocket, a silent alarm. The caller ID was an encrypted, untraceable number. Gideon. He ducked into a cramped, noisy server room, the roar of the cooling fans providing a cloak of white noise. He answered, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. "Did you find anything?" Gideon's voice was unrecognizable. The calm, slightly patronizing tone of their cafe meeting was gone. In its place was a voice stripped of all emotion, a flat, dead thing. "Find anything, Julian?" "I found everything." The file wasn't just a file. It's a key. It unlocked a partitioned, heavily cloaked directory on our own off-site servers. A place that shouldn't exist. "What's in it?" Julian pressed his knuckles white as he gripped the phone. "It's a ledger," Gideon said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "A black ledger. It's all here. Every glitch, every accident for the past 18 months. It's a meticulously documented conspiracy." Julian's breath caught in his throat. "What kind of conspiracy?" "It's twofold." Gideon explained the words coming in a clipped, precise rush, the voice of a man reporting on the end of the world. "First, embezzlement on a scale I can't even fathom. They're using the system's own complexities to their advantage. High-value shipments, like the Chronos processors, are being flagged by a hidden algorithm. They're diverted, relabeled as damaged, or lost in transit, and written off. Then they're funneled out of the network through a series of shell logistics companies and sold on the black market. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars, Julian." Julian leaned against the server rack, the metal cool against his feverish skin. It was worse than he imagined. "But the theft is only part of it." Gideon continued, his voice cracking for the first time. "The sabotage, the high-profile failures like the St. Jude's delivery, that's the second phase. It's a coordinated attack designed to do one thing: drive down the company's stock value. The ledger details a plan for a hostile takeover by a rival corporation, timed to coincide with our next quarterly earnings report. They're not just robbing us, Julian. They're trying to kill the company and buy its corpse for pennies on the dollar." A wave of nausea washed over Julian. This was war. A silent corporate war waged with algorithms and ghost data, and he hadn't even known it was happening. Who, he breathed. Who is doing this? There was a long, terrible silence on the other end of the line, filled only by the crackle of the encrypted connection. When Gideon finally spoke, his voice was hollowed out, a mere echo of the man Julian knew. "The ledger is perfect, Julian. Too perfect. Every transaction, every security override, every offshore account transfer is documented. The digital signatures are flawless, the biometric data, it's all there. And every single piece of evidence, every last byte of data has been perfectly, meticulously, and irrefutably framed to point to one person." Another pause, this one stretching into an eternity. Julian's blood ran cold. "Who, Gideon?" he demanded, his voice a raw whisper. "Tell me who," Gideon said. The word did not compute. It was a foreign sound, a piece of a language Julian didn't understand. He felt the world tilt on its axis, the roaring fans of the server room fading into a distant hum. What did you say?" "It's me, Julian," Gideon repeated, his voice breaking completely, now the sound of a man confessing to his own murder. "Every authorization came from my terminal. Every transfer was authenticated with my security credentials. The offshore account where the money is being laundered, it's in my name. The encrypted communications with the rival corporation, they originated from my IP address. The ghost is me." Denial, hot and fierce, surged through Julian. "No, that's impossible. You're lying. This is some kind of trick." "I wish it were," Gideon choked out. "I've spent the last 48 hours trying to break it, trying to find a flaw, a single piece of code that proves it's a frame job. But there's nothing. It's the most perfect frame-up I've ever seen. Whoever did this is a genius. They've used my own security protocols against me. They've built a digital cage around me, and I'm the one who designed the lock." Julian slid down the server rack, his legs giving way. He sat on the cold floor, the phone pressed hard against his ear. His mind was a chaotic storm of memories: Gideon at his father's funeral, a pillar of strength in Julian's grief. Gideon teaching him how to sail, their laughter echoing across the water. Gideon in the cafe promising to look into the file, his expression one of brotherly concern. And now this, the man he trusted above all others, the one person he had turned to in his darkest hour. His friend, his brother, a traitor. "Why?" Julian whispered the question, a shard of glass in his throat. "Why would you do this, Gid?" "I didn't," Gideon said, his voice raw with desperation. "Julian, you have to believe me, I didn't do this. Someone is playing a much bigger game. They've made me the scapegoat." But the seeds of doubt planted by Gideon's own initial skepticism had taken root. Had Gideon's concern in the cafe been an act? Was he trying to gauge how much Julian knew, Had he been the ghost all along, laughing silently as Julian chased shadows? The evidence was irrefutable. The logic was cold and absolute. And the betrayal was a physical pain, a tearing in the center of his soul. "I have to go," Julian said, his voice as dead as Gideon's had been. "Julian, wait. We have to fight this. Together. You can't." Julian ended the call. He sat in the roaring darkness of the server room for a long time, the burner phone feeling like a dead weight in his hand. The complex conspiracy, the hostile takeover, the millions of dollars, all of it faded into the background, overshadowed by the one simple, devastating fact. The ghost wore the face of his best friend. He was alone, utterly, completely alone. The last bastion of trust in his world had been obliterated. He had walked into his own company to hunt a monster only to find that the monster had been sleeping in his own house all along. Eventually, he forced himself to his feet. He had to walk out of this room back onto the warehouse floor and continue to pack boxes as Leo Carter, a man who didn't exist. He had to look Elara in the eye and pretend his entire world hadn't just been burned to the ground. As he stepped back into the cacophony of the warehouse, the familiar sights and sounds seemed alien and menacing. Every scanner beep was an accusation. Every indifferent face was a potential enemy. He was no longer a CEO in disguise. He was a man with no allies, no one to trust, and a truth so poisonous he couldn't share it with anyone. The game had changed. He wasn't just fighting for his company anymore. He was fighting in a world where his closest friend was his greatest enemy. For 2 days, Julian moved through the world in a haze of cold, silent fury. The betrayal had cauterized his grief, leaving behind a hard, sharp-edged resolve. He went to work at the hub, packed his boxes, met his quotas. He was a perfect automaton, his physical body executing its tasks, while his mind worked feverishly in the background, replaying every conversation, every memory of Gideon searching for the lie. He found it everywhere. He needed to see him. Not to hear excuses or explanations, but to look into the eyes of the man who had destroyed his trust and force him to say it to his face. He sent one more text from the burner phone, a single address and a time. It wasn't a request. It was a summons. The location was a derelict shipping yard down by the industrial canals, a place where the city's ambitions had rusted and died. Skeletal cranes stood silhouetted against a bruised purple sky. The air was thick with the smell of decay and stagnant water. It was a graveyard, a fitting place for the death of a friendship. Julian was there first, standing in the shadow of a mountain of forgotten shipping containers. When Gideon's car pulled up, Julian felt a visceral, animalistic rage he had never known. This wasn't a CEO or a strategist. This was a man who had been wounded to his very soul. Gideon got out of the car looking older and more broken than Julian had ever seen him. His usual confident posture was gone, replaced by the stoop of a man carrying an unbearable weight. "Julian, thank you for coming. We need to talk." Gideon began, his voice hoarse. He didn't get any further. Julian crossed the space between them in 3 long strides and slammed him against the side of his car. The metallic thud echoed in the silence of the yard. Julian's forearm was pressed hard against Gideon's throat, his face inches away. "Talk!" Julian snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "There's nothing to talk about. I want you to look me in the eye and tell me how much you got for it. How much was my father's legacy worth to you? How much did they pay you to sell me out?" Gideon didn't struggle. He just stared back, his eyes filled with a deep, bottomless pain. It wasn't like that. He choked out, his breath constricted. "Don't lie to me," Julian roared, shoving him harder against the car. "I saw the data. My best friend. My brother. You stood by my side at my father's grave. And you were already planning this, weren't you? Every piece of advice, every friendly warning. Was it all a lie?" "No, Julian, please, you have to listen to me," Gideon gasped. "You're right. I helped them. I gave them the access they needed, but I didn't have a choice." "Everyone has a choice," Julian shouted, his rage reaching a fever pitch. He drew his fist back, the urge to shatter the face of this traitor, an overwhelming primal need. "My daughter," Gideon cried out the words, a raw, desperate sob. "They have my daughter." The words stopped Julian's fist an inch from Gideon's jaw. His arm froze, trembling with adrenaline and confusion. He slowly, reluctantly eased the pressure on Gideon's throat. "What are you talking about?" Gideon slumped against the car, his whole body shaking. He pulled out his phone with trembling hands and swiped to a photo. It was a picture of a beautiful, smiling little girl of about 8 with Gideon's eyes and a head of bright red curls. but she was in a hospital bed, tubes and wires snaking from her small arms. "Her name is Maya Gideon," said his voice thick with unshed tears. "She has a rare genetic disorder. Her immune system is attacking her own heart. The doctors here gave her 6 months. But there's an experimental treatment, a new gene therapy available only at a clinic in Switzerland. The cost? It's astronomical. $2 million. Insurance won't touch it." Julian stared at the photo, the cold fury inside him beginning to fracture, confused by a wave of an emotion he didn't want to feel. "I was trying to find a way," Gideon continued, his voice breaking. "Selling my house, cashing in my retirement. It wasn't enough. I was desperate. And then, he came to me." Julian asked, his voice now a quiet, dangerous whisper. "Silas Blackwood." The name landed like a physical blow. Julian staggered back, his mind reeling. Silas, the mentor, the family friend, the man who had spoken so reverently of his father. It made no sense. It made a terrifying amount of sense. "He approached me 3 months ago." Gideon explained, the story pouring out of him now in a torrent of shame and desperation. "He said he knew about Maya. He said he could help. He offered to anonymously fund her entire treatment. No strings attached, he said. A gift from one old friend to another's." Julian could already see the strings. They were chains. A week later, he called in the favor. Gideon said, his eyes squeezed shut in shame. He didn't ask for much. Just a temporary elevation of a specific user's security clearance. Just for an hour. He said it was for a sensitive internal audit he was conducting off the books. I knew it was wrong, but I thought, $2 million for my daughter's life. I did it. I was a fool. "What you did," Gideon continued, looking up at Julian. His face a mask of self-loathing, was give him the keys to the kingdom. He used that 1 hour of elevated access to clone my security credentials, create a backdoor into my own terminal, and plant the seeds of the entire frame job. He didn't need my ongoing help. He just needed me to open the door once. After that, he could make it look like I was doing anything he wanted. When I realized what was happening, it was too late. He had me. If I went to you, if I said anything, he would not only pull Maya's funding. He would release the proof that I was the one who granted the initial breach. I was trapped. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Silas's words in the boardroom, "Your father, Buwan," was a man of action. He wasn't mentoring Julian. He was goading him, pushing him, enjoying the show. Silas had orchestrated everything. The sabotage, the theft, the pressure from the board. He had been playing a long, patient game, and Julian and Gideon were just pawns on his board. Thorn, Julian realized, was just another pawn, a useful attack dog to manage the floor, while Silas pulled the strings from the tower. Why, Julian asked, the single word encompassing a universe of disbelief. He was my father's friend. He helped build this company. He was my father's rival, Gideon corrected him grimly. He respected your father, but he also resented him. He always believed Alistair was too cautious, too sentimental. Silas believes a company's only purpose is profit by any means necessary. He thinks the soul of the company, the things your father valued, the people, is a weakness. He wants to gut it, sell it for parts, and build a leaner, more ruthless empire on its bones. Julian stared out at the rusting cranes, the graveyard of industry around them. Silas was trying to turn Aethelred into this, a hollowed-out relic of a better time. The cold rage returned, but it was different now. It was no longer aimed at the broken man in front of him. It was focused, purified, and aimed squarely at the smiling, grandfatherly face of Silas Blackwood. He was faced with a choice. He could believe the perfect, irrefutable digital evidence that condemned his friend. Or he could believe this messy, desperate, all-too-human story of a father's love and a master manipulator's cruelty. He looked at Gideon, at the genuine agony in his eyes, and thought of the lifetime of friendship that stood between them. Data could be faked. Evidence could be planted. But the look in Gideon's eyes was real. "All right," Julian said, his voice steady, now filled with a grim new purpose. "I believe you." A wave of relief so profound it was almost painful washed over Gideon's face. "Julian, save it." Julian cut him off, his tone. "All business now. We don't have time for apologies. We have time for war." He started pacing his mind, the strategist's mind kicking into high gear. "The digital evidence against you is perfect, which means we can't fight it with more digital evidence. It's your word against a mountain of data he created. We need something else, something he can't deny, something that links him directly to the money to the rival corporation. His private server, Gideon said immediately, his own focus snapping back. He's too arrogant to trust a third party. He keeps all his real communications, his real ledgers on a closed-loop air-gapped server in his office at the tower. How secure is it? It's a fortress, Gideon said grimly. Biometric locks pressure plates a direct line to my security teams. My own teams who now probably have orders to shoot me on sight. Getting to it is impossible. Impossible is just a problem we haven't solved yet. Julian countered a spark of his father's relentless drive flaring in his eyes. He stopped pacing and looked at Gideon, the two of them standing together in the twilight surrounded by the ghosts of industry. They were no longer the CEO and his head of security, nor the betrayed and the betrayer. They were two men bound by a common enemy and a desperate long-shot plan. We're going to get into that office, Gideon, Julian said, his voice low and certain. We are going to get that data, and then we're going to burn Silas Blackwood's empire to the ground. The Aethelred annual charity gala was the glittering jewel in the company's corporate crown, a night of performative generosity, where the city's elite gathered to sip champagne and congratulate each other on their success. It was a world of silk gowns, tailored tuxedos, and smiles as brittle and expensive as the crystal glasses they held. This year, the event was held in the grand ballroom of the Aethelred Tower itself, a two-story cavern of marble and glass. And tonight it was the stage for their impossibly audacious plan. Julian Croft played his part to perfection. He was the beleaguered CEO, the dutiful host, his face a carefully constructed mask of weary professionalism. He moved through the crowd, shaking hands, nodding at pleasantries, his mind a million miles away, running through the intricate split-second timeline of the heist. Across the city, in a small, anonymous tech rental office space she had secured under a false name, Elara Vance was at her station. She was their eye in the sky, their mission control. Before her were 3 monitors displaying a dizzying array of data, the building's power grid schematics, its security network layout, and a live feed of the Aethelred Logistics network. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady on the keyboard. And in the building's sub-basement, amidst the roar of the HVAC systems, Gideon waited. He was dressed in the gray coveralls of a maintenance engineer, a tool belt slung around his waist. He was a ghost, preparing to walk through the walls he himself had built. They were connected by a micro earpiece, a triple encrypted short-range channel. Phase 1. Julian, you're on, Gideon's voice murmured in his ear. Julian took a deep breath and began to navigate the glittering sea of people, his target in sight. Silas Blackwood was holding court near the orchestra, looking every bit the elder statesman in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. He was laughing, a rich, confident sound that made Julian's blood run cold. Silas, Julian said, his voice smooth as he approached. A wonderful turnout. Silas turned, his eyes crinkling in that familiar avuncular way. Julian, I was just telling Senator Ross about your decisive handling of that unfortunate Kronos incident. A fine recovery. Your father would be proud. The praise was a poisoned dart meant to remind Julian of his recent failures. My father taught me to clean up my own messes. Julian replied, his words laced with a double meaning only he understood. He had to keep Silas talking, keep him anchored in this room for the next 15 minutes. At that moment, Gideon's voice came over the comms. I'm in the main service corridor, approaching the executive elevator shaft. Simultaneously, Elara's fingers flew across her keyboard. Her part of the plan was the most delicate. She wasn't just causing a blackout. That would be too crude, too obvious. She was initiating a targeted brownout, a subtle power surge directed at the non-essential systems on the 49th through 51st floors. It was designed to look like a feedback loop from the building's new solar power array, a known minor bug in the system. Executing power surge protocol. Now, she whispered into her microphone. In the grand ballroom, the lights flickered for a half-second. The orchestra faltered, and a nervous murmur went through the crowd. In Silas Blackwood's 50th floor office suite, the lights went out completely, and the environmental controls and secondary security systems defaulted to a low-power emergency mode. Minor power fluctuation, Julian said calmly to a nervous-looking Silas. The new solar grid is still a bit temperamental. Elara status, Gideon's voice was tense. It worked, she replied, her eyes glued to the security network diagram. The primary sensors around Silas's office are offline for diagnostics. The pressure plates are inactive, but the main door lock is still on a dedicated power circuit. That's all, you, Gideon. Gideon was already at the elevator shaft. He pried open the service panel and hot-wired the lift, sending it up to the 50th floor in silent manual mode. He exited into the darkened, silent corridor of the executive wing. It was eerie, a place of immense power now plunged into stillness. He moved with a swift, silent purpose to the reinforced oak doors of Silas's office. The biometric lock glowed red. Spoofing the biometrics now, he muttered, attaching a small device to the scanner. This will take 60 seconds. In the ballroom, Julian was engaged in a tense conversational dance with Silas. The older man's smile had faded, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. I must say, Julian, for a company built on precision, we seem to be having a lot of glitches lately, Silas said, his eyes probing. Every system has its breaking point, Julian countered, glancing at his watch. 50 seconds had passed. The important thing is knowing how to fix it when it does. Beep. The light on Silas's office door turned green. Gideon was in. I'm inside, he whispered. The server is in the back behind the bookcase. It's air-gapped, just as I thought. Julian, it's your turn. Julian excused himself from Silas, feigning a need to check on the power situation. He moved quickly to a secluded balcony overlooking the city lights. He pulled out a customized tablet, its screen already glowing. Connect me, Gideon. Gideon plugged a small black device into the server's hidden maintenance port. It was a wireless bridge, a high-risk piece of tech that would connect the air-gapped server to the building's internal Wi-Fi for a few minutes, just long enough for Julian to work his magic. You're in, Gideon said. But the firewall is a beast. It's a custom build. I've never seen anything like it. On his tablet, Julian saw it. A wall of code, intricate and deadly. He began to type, his fingers a blur. This was his world now, a digital battle of wits against a master programmer. That's when the complication arrived. A silent alarm had been triggered on Silas's personal watch, a failsafe linked to the server's physical casing being opened. It didn't alert security. It alerted him. Silas's eyes narrowed. He looked around the ballroom, his gaze sweeping past the smiling faces. He looked towards the elevators. Elara, he's moving. Julian said, his voice tight. His eyes still locked on the code he was trying to break. Silas is moving. He's heading for the elevators. Security is still dealing with the power surge on 49, she reported, her voice strained. But he's alone. Gideon, you have maybe 3 minutes before he's on your level. I'm not through the firewall yet, Julian hissed. It's learning. It's adapting to my attacks. Then be faster, Gideon said grimly. Standing guard by the office door, a heavy wrench gripped in his hand. His maintenance worker disguise now a grim necessity. Julian's mind went into overdrive. He couldn't break the wall, so he would go around it. He found a loophole, a diagnostic subroutine left over from the manufacturer that Silas must have overlooked. He exploited it, creating a feedback loop that momentarily confused the firewall's defenses. A single line appeared on his screen, access granted. He was in. The server's directory was before him. It was all there, hidden ledgers, encrypted communications with the rival firm offshore bank records, and a file simply labeled contingency. I'm in, starting the download, he said. A progress bar appeared on his tablet. 1%, 2%. He's in the elevator. Elara's voice was a panicked whisper. Ascending now. You have 60 seconds. Less. It's too slow, Julian said. The files are massive. Download the contingency file first, Gideon ordered. It's the smallest and probably the most important. It's his insurance policy. Julian's fingers flew. He canceled the main download and targeted the single file. The progress bar jumped. 50%, 70%. The soft chime of the elevator arriving on the 50th floor echoed down the hall. Gideon flattened himself against the wall behind the door, his wrench held high. 90%, 95%. Heavy, confident footsteps approached the office door. Download complete. Got it. Get out of there, Julian shouted into the comms. Gideon didn't hesitate. He ripped the wireless bridge from the server port, slammed the casing shut, and slipped out of the office just as Silas's hand was reaching for the biometric scanner. He ducked into a darkened alcove as Silas entered his office, his eyes sweeping the room, sensing that something was wrong. Gideon was already at the service elevator, his heart trying to hammer its way out of his chest. Elara had already restored full power, her part in the charade complete. Julian calmly walked back into the gala from the balcony, his tablet gone, his face a mask of composed relief. He found Silas returning to the ballroom, a thunderous look on his face. Everything all right, Silas? Julian asked, his voice dripping with false concern. Everything is perfectly fine. Silas snarled, his eyes locking with Julian's. He knew. He didn't know how, but he knew something had happened. Julian held his gaze for a long moment. He had the data. The ghost was in his trap. He allowed himself the smallest, most infinitesimal of nods, a silent gesture that was both a promise and a death sentence. The war had just become a firefight, and he was holding the gun. The dawn that broke over Vantage City was cold and clear. In his penthouse, Julian Croft had not slept. He had spent the night with Gideon decrypting the contingency file. What they found was worse than they could have imagined. It was Silas Blackwood's entire playbook, a detailed chronicle of his 18-month campaign to systematically ruin Aethelred Logistics. It contained the unedited financial ledgers, the communications with the rival corporation, and a detailed plan for the post-takeover restructuring, complete with a list of board members to be ousted and assets to be liquidated. But the true prize, the undeniable killshot, was a series of video logs. Silas, in his arrogance, had recorded his secure calls with the rival CEO. It was all there, his voice, his face, his gleeful articulation of the entire conspiracy. At 7 a.m., Julian sent out a single company-wide communication. Emergency all-hands meeting. 9 a.m., Aethelred Auditorium. Attendance is mandatory for all board members, senior management, and department representatives. Your presence is not optional. The auditorium, a state-of-the-art theater on the third floor of the tower, was buzzing with a nervous, confused energy. Board members huddled in one section, whispering amongst themselves. Managers from every department filled the central rows. And near the back, looking small and out of place in the sea of suits, was a delegation from the North Hub. Elara Vance was among them, her expression a mixture of anxiety and defiance. She had been summoned by name, a fact that had not gone unnoticed by the other floor workers. The lights dimmed. A single spotlight illuminated the stage. Julian Croft walked out from the wings, not to the polished lectern, but to the center of the stage. He wore a simple dark suit, but he moved with a newfound authority, a grounded stillness that was completely different from the remote, uncertain CEO they were used to. He let the silence settle his eyes, scanning the crowd, pausing for a fraction of a second when he met Elara's gaze. "Good morning," he began, his voice calm and clear, amplified by the theater's perfect acoustics. "I'm sure you're all wondering why you're here. I'm not going to talk to you today about quarterly earnings or shareholder value. I'm going to talk to you about the soul of this company." A confused murmur rippled through the audience. "My father, Alistair Croft, didn't build this company to be a machine of pure profit," Julian continued. "He built it to be a testament to reliability, to human ingenuity, and to the idea that every single person in the chain from the boardroom to the loading dock matters. Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that. I was trying to run the company from a spreadsheet, and I failed. I let the soul of this company begin to rot." He started to pace, his movements slow and deliberate. "I kept hearing about a ghost in the machine, a series of inexplicable errors that were hurting our reputation and our people. So I went looking for it. To do that, I had to become a ghost myself." He stopped and looked directly at the North Hub delegation. "For the past few weeks, I haven't been your CEO. I've been a man named Leo Carter, a picker on the floor of the North Hub." A collective gasp went through the auditorium. The board members stared in stunned disbelief. But it was Elara's reaction that Julian watched. Her face went through a rapid, painful series of transformations: shock, confusion, a flicker of betrayal, and then finally a slow dawning wave of understanding. Her entire world, her perception of the quiet, brilliant man she had come to trust, had just been turned inside out. As Julian said, his voice hardening, "I saw the truth. I saw a culture of fear where dedicated employees were humiliated for metrics they couldn't control. I saw failing equipment and ignored safety protocols. I saw a manager who ruled by intimidation, and I saw a conspiracy to deliberately sabotage our most critical operations." He turned his attention to the board members, his gaze settling on one man. "And I found the ghost." On the massive screen behind him, the contingency files directory appeared. For the past 18 months, Julian announced, his voice booming through the theater, "Aethelred Logistics has been the target of a systematic attack, orchestrated from the inside by one of our own." He began to walk them through the evidence. The hidden ledgers appeared on the screen, showing the millions of dollars siphoned from the company. The schematics of the sabotage operations, from the St. Jude's delivery to the Kronos theft, were laid bare. Marcus Thorne, sitting in the front row, began to sweat, his face turning a sickly shade of pale. Silas Blackwood, however, remained perfectly calm. He even managed a small, pitying smile. When Julian finished, Silas stood up. "Julian, this is a very compelling work of fiction," he said, his voice oozing with condescending authority. "It's clear the pressure has gotten to you. You've fabricated this elaborate fantasy to excuse your own mismanagement. This data is clearly faked. I ask the rest of the board to see this for what it is, a desperate, pathetic attempt to shift blame." Several board members nodded, their expressions uncertain. The data was damning, but Silas's confidence was unshakable. "You're right, Silas," Julian said calmly. "Data can be fabricated, so I thought I should bring something a little more personal." He spoke a single command into his lapel mic. "Play the final file." And then the screen came to life. It was a video call. The image was crystal clear. On one side was Silas Blackwood sitting in his own office. On the other was the CEO of their largest competitor. "The stock is down another 7%. Silas's voice on the recording set a smug grin on his face. "The St. Jude's incident was a masterstroke. The market is terrified. One more push, one more high-profile failure, and the board will have no choice but to accept your offer. Julian won't know what hit him." The auditorium was plunged into a stunned, absolute silence. Silas Blackwood's face, live in the room, had turned to stone. The color drained from it, his calm arrogance shattering like glass. He was watching his own ghost, his own recorded voice condemn him utterly. The video played on a gruesome, undeniable confession of everything. The bribery, the frame job on Gideon, the gleeful anticipation of the company's ruin. When it finished, the screen went black. No one moved. No one breathed. The silence was broken by a single scraping sound. Marcus Thorne had bolted from his chair and was sprinting for a side exit. He never made it. The doors flew open, and a team of uniformed security officers led by Gideon blocked his path. Thorne tried to double back, but Gideon was on him in a flash, tackling him to the ground in a tangle of flailing limbs and panicked shouts. The pathetic, chaotic struggle was over in seconds. Gideon hauled a whimpering Thorne to his feet, his face a mask of cold, hard justice. Two other officers walked calmly down the central aisle towards the board members. They stopped on either side of Silas Blackwood, who remained standing frozen, a statue of pure, unadulterated hubris that had finally cracked. He didn't resist as they placed him in restraints. He just stared at Julian, his eyes burning with a hatred that was terrifying in its intensity. "You, Silas," hissed his voice a venomous whisper. "You were supposed to be weak, like your father." "My father was strong enough to build this company," Julian said, his voice ringing with a newfound power. "And I'm strong enough to save it." As Silas and a blubbering Thorne were escorted out, the auditorium erupted. It was a chaotic symphony of shouts, questions, and frantic phone calls. Board members were shouting their innocence, managers were staring in open-mouthed shock. Through it all, Julian's eyes found Elara's. She was standing now, her face pale, but her eyes shining with a fierce, complicated light. He had deceived her, yes, but he had also validated every frustration, every suspicion she had ever had. He had proven her right. He had cleaned the fuel line. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, the same one he had given Silas the night before. But this one was different. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. A promise of a new beginning. The reckoning was over. The hard work of rebuilding was about to begin. In the weeks that followed the reckoning, a fragile quiet settled over Aethelred Logistics. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of wreckage and uncertainty. The news of Silas Blackwood's corporate espionage and Marcus Thorne's reign of terror had become a business world legend, a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms across the country. The company's stock had plummeted, then stabilized, held afloat by the dramatic narrative of the young CEO who had saved his own company from the inside out. For the first time in his life, Julian Croft moved into his father's office. He had left it untouched since Alistair's death, a silent wood-paneled museum. But now it felt different. It was no longer an intimidating shrine to a legend he could never live up to. It was a workshop, and he had a broken company to rebuild. He spent his days in grueling meetings with lawyers, federal investigators, and a shaken board of directors. But he spent his nights on the phone with Elara Vance. She had in the interim become his de facto chief of operations, the one person whose judgment he trusted implicitly. She was still based at the North Hub, her feet firmly on the ground, and she fed him the unvarnished truth of the company's condition. The fear, the confusion, but also a tiny, flickering spark of hope. A month after the arrests, Julian called a second all-hands meeting. This time the mood in the auditorium was not one of confusion, but of quiet, anxious anticipation. He walked onto the stage and the room fell silent. A month ago, he began his voice devoid of its previous theatricality. We removed a cancer from this company. But the disease was allowed to spread because the body was already weak. And that weakness started here. It started with me. He looked out at the faces of his employees, from the executives in the front to the warehouse workers in the back. I was an invisible CEO. I tried to lead from a distance, and in my absence, a culture of fear took root. I saw numbers on a page, but I failed to see the people behind those numbers, the men and women who are the true engine of this company. My journey as Leo Carter taught me a lesson my MBA never could. A foundation of fear will always crumble. Today, we lay a new one. He began to outline his vision, and with each point, a palpable sense of change, of real tangible change, swept through the room. First, we are investing in you. Effective immediately, I have authorized a $40 million upgrade of all frontline equipment, starting with the scanners, lifts, and sorting machinery at the North Hub. Your tools should help you, not fight you. A wave of applause, hesitant at first, then growing stronger, started from the back of the room. Second, we are ending the tyranny of the algorithm. Scan rates and metrics will now be used as diagnostic tools to help us find problems in the system, not as weapons to punish our people. We will value accuracy, safety, and teamwork over pure, unsustainable speed. He paused, letting the words sink in. Third, from this day forward, we will have a culture of absolute transparency. To ensure this, I am establishing a new independent office, the Office of Operational Integrity. This office will report directly to me, and its sole purpose is to listen to you. It will oversee a new whistleblower program, one that is truly anonymous and protected, which I am calling the Alistair Protocol, in honor of my father. He looked across the room, his eyes finding Elara. This new office requires a leader with unquestionable integrity, a deep understanding of our operations from the ground up, and the courage to speak truth to power. There is only one person I know who fits that description. It is my honor to announce the new Director of Operational Integrity for Aethelred Logistics, Ms. Elara Vance. The spotlight found Elara in her seat. A stunned silence fell over the room, followed by an eruption of applause, loudest and most heartfelt from the North Hub delegation. She stood up, her face a mixture of shock and profound emotion, and for a moment her eyes met Julian's across the distance. It was a confirmation of everything they had fought for. The months that followed were not easy. Rebuilding trust was a slow, arduous process, but the changes were real. The new equipment arrived at the North Hub, sleek and efficient. The old punitive public monitors displaying scan rates were taken down. In their place, new training centers were built. Julian was a different CEO. He spent 2 days a week out of the tower walking the floors of his facilities, not as a disguised ghost, but as himself. He learned people's names. He listened to their frustrations and their ideas. He got his hands dirty. He was no longer running a spreadsheet, he was leading a company. Elara, in her new role, was a force of nature. She was fair, relentless, and she became the fierce advocate the employees had never had. She tore down Thorne's toxic systems and replaced them with processes built on common sense and respect. The ghost of the machine had been replaced by the conscience of the company. 6 months after the reckoning, Julian drove out to the North Hub. He didn't announce his visit. He walked in through the main employee entrance, no longer Leo Carter, but no longer the remote god from the tower either. He was just Julian. The sound of the place was different. The frantic, high-pitched whine of overworked machinery had been replaced by a more powerful, rhythmic hum. The workers still moved with purpose, but the desperate, haunted look in their eyes was gone. He saw people talking, even laughing as they worked. He saw a supervisor helping a new hire, patiently demonstrating a technique instead of shouting about metrics. He saw Peterson, the young man Thorne had humiliated, now training a team of his own, a look of quiet confidence on his face. He found Elara not in her new office, but on the floor, standing with a tablet talking to a team of engineers about a new workflow optimization. She saw him, and a warm, genuine smile lit up her face. "Mr. Croft," she said, her tone teasing, slumming it again. "Just checking on the new foundation," he replied, smiling back. They walked together side by side through the revitalized heart of the company. They moved past the new quiet AGVs, past the now silent spot where the Chronos processors had been found, past the loading dock where he had won an unwinnable game. "My father would have liked you," Julian said, his voice quiet. "I think I would have liked him too," she replied. "He built something incredible here, Julian." He built the engine, Julian said, stopping and looking out at the vast orderly dance of packages and people. We're just cleaning the fuel line. She laughed, a clear, happy sound that echoed in the cavernous space. It's a start. He looked at her, at the intelligence in her eyes, the strength in her character, the woman who had trusted a ghost and helped him save a kingdom. The professional partnership they had forged in the crucible of the crisis had slowly, quietly become something more. It was a bond of deep respect, of shared purpose, and the unspoken promise of a future yet to be written. What's next, Director Vance? He asked. Tomorrow, she said, her eyes meeting his full of light and possibility. And the day after that, we just keep building. He knew she wasn't just talking about the company. As they stood there, surrounded by the powerful rhythmic heartbeat of a company rediscovering its soul, Julian Croft finally felt at peace. He was no longer living in his father's shadow. He was standing in his own light, and he was not alone. And so our story comes to a close. It began with a man who had a title but had lost his purpose, a leader who had forgotten the most fundamental rule of leadership: you cannot care for the garden from the window of your castle. You must be willing to walk the rows, to feel the soil, to see the pests that thrive in the shadows of neglect. Julian Croft's journey into the heart of his own company was more than just an investigation. It was a pilgrimage. He learned that the true soul of a business isn't found in its mission statement or its stock price, but in the hands and hearts of the people who show up every day. He learned that respect isn't a memo sent from on high. It's a culture built from the ground up, through presence, through listening, and through the courage to fix what is broken, starting with yourself. Real change doesn't happen in a single dramatic moment of confrontation, but in the 1,000 quiet choices that follow the choice to invest in people, to reward integrity, and to lead with empathy. Thank you for spending your time with us and for sharing in this story. If it resonated with you, if it reminded you of the importance of showing up in your own life, we hope you'll consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Your support allows us to continue bringing you stories that we hope not only entertain, but also inspire a little reflection. Until next time, be well, and remember to tend to your own garden.